Provost, that's the meeting live now.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. McCaskill. To go back then, Councillor Fairweather, your first motion, the removal of Councillor Speed as Vice Convener of Children and Learning of the Children and Learning Committee. If we could just take on from there. You hear me?
I'll just yes, right. I'll just be moving that as it is. I don't know if there's any amendments.
Are there any? We've got a seconder.
Yes, we got a seconder.
Are there any amendments? I can't see any hands.
Hands up, Provost.
Provost, from Councillors Hands and Speed.
Okay. Right. First of all, in Councillor Hands.
Apologies, mine was a legacy hand.
Sorry, I can't hear you very well. Councillor Hands, could you say that again, please?
Yeah, my hand was a legacy hand. I put it down.
You're very difficult, Mr. McCaskill. Did you pick that up?
Yes, Provost, and also Councillor Speed, but I see Councillor Speed's hand has come down now just to confirm that there's no other members wishing to speak.
Right. I think Councillor Cheap was the next one.
No, Cheap. Provost, it's next motion.
Okay, right. Anyone else? Is that it, Councillor? Is that it, Mr. McCaskill? No other hands shown?
That's correct, Provost.
Okay. Can we agree that motion?
Agreed.
Right. Councillor Fairweather, your second motion, please.
Thank you, Provost. I move that Councillor Stirlett be appointed Vice Convener of Children and Learning Committee.
And I second that, Provost.
Okay. And any amendment?
Councillor Bell has her hand up, Provost.
Right, please carry on.
Sorry, it was just sticking. I couldn't get it down.
Okay, fine. Anyone else? Are we clear?
No other speakers, Provost.
Right, thank you. Is that motion agreed?
Agreed.
Motion number 3 is to remove Councillor Speed as Vice Convener of the Integration Joint Board, and that following such removal, request that the Chief Executive provide notice of this to the member of the Integration Board.
And I'm seconding that, Provost.
And Councillor Fairweather moving it. Right, have we got any amendments on that?
Mr. Bell.
Yeah.
I'd like to propose that we retain the status quo and leave Councillor Speed as the Vice Chair of the IGB. She has delivered a superb role on the IGB and has contributed hugely to its success, originally as Chair and now as Vice Chair, and I would hate to see that continuity broken. I think she's a valuable asset to the IGB and would wholeheartedly support her staying in that position.
Thank you, Councillor Bell. Have you got a seconder?
I'm happy to second that, Provost.
Thank you very much.
On the basic, I just have a few words on it as well. Simply to echo what Councillor Bell has just said, there's absolutely no reason to remove Councillor Speed from this role whatsoever. This obsession with politics in the administration, to have somebody from the administration to have to do this job. When will this council ever learn? We need to appoint the best people to the best roles on these boards. And without doubt, I've been very impressed with Councillor Speed's dedication, commitment, caring attitude to the IJB, and why on earth the administration would want to remove somebody like that just for the sake that they have removed themselves from administration. I hate to say it's anything to do with money, but it's more importantly the complete lack of understanding that the best person for the best job failed to understand the reasoning whatsoever.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Cheap. Mr. McCaskill, are there any other comments? Mr. McCaskill, we put it to the vote?
Yes, no, sorry, Provost, I put my hand up.
Yeah, okay. Go on.
Can I just say I wholeheartedly agree with the comments regarding Councillor Speed. In fact, I had a conversation with Councillor Speed this morning. I can assure you, I would not want to lose Councillor Speed from the Integrated Joint Board. However, what we have to remember that is very much a big part of our budget setting, and that should be in the hands of the administration. I asked Councillor Speed this morning if she would be prepared to stay on the Integrated Joint Board, and if you'd just given me time, I would have been putting that forward. And hopefully, as she said this morning, she would be happy to do so. But my motion as it stands. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you very much, Councillor Fairweather. Mr. McCaskill, could
Yeah, as Provost, we have Councillors Boyd and Macmillan Douglas wishing to speak.
Okay, Councillor Boyd.
I'm unsure what's going on at the present time, but I will. But therefore, I'll just make my comments. The comments are as Councillor Sheep has said. I was certainly hoping we were moving away from the situation that we've seen in the papers over the last few weeks of the unhealthy culture within the administration, and this was an ideal opportunity to have kept Councillor Speed, who has done an excellent job in that role, and exactly what David said before. The right people in the right places. I've consistently said that over the last 9 years. We should be leaving the petty politics out of this and allowing the right people to be doing the right jobs. You don't have to sit on it is wrong, it is false to say you can only get things done if you're in administration. I have a £5 million early learning centre. I have never managed not to get anything for Carnoustie because, in fact, the only time there's ever been is when petty politics have come in and people have tried to manipulate it the other way around. The officers come forward with things, and that's where you get your work from. But this nonsense that you have to be part of it.
Point of order, Provost. Point of order. Can you?
It's a lie. I wasn't going to say it, but I'll actually say it. It's a lie.
Right, could we just stop there? Let's just remember where we are. We're in the chamber. Let's use the correct language, okay? And Councillor Fairweather explained the situation, so that's fine. Thank you very much for your comments, Councillor Boyd. Councillor Macmillan Douglas, you were the next one.
Provost, thank you. I too have worked very happily and I hope productively with Councillor Speed, for whom I have a high regard. However, if we're going to talk about competence to help run an integrated joint board, in Councillor Miles, who is going to be put forward, we have somebody who's actually run the council for, I think, 6, perhaps 7 years. I'm not sure I can remember all the years he has done it for. He is also a very well respected, and I know he's well respected because I know other people on the board. He is a very well respected member of the Tayside Health Board. And I think if we're not going to rant and we're actually going to look at things objectively, the caliber of Councillor Miles and bringing him forward at this time onto the joint board is a substantial, or would be, we haven't passed it yet, would be a substantial strengthening of that board. Thank you, Provost.
Mr. McCaskill, are there any other hands?
Yes, Provost, from Councillor Hands, Devine, Speed, and Councillor MacDonald.
Okay, if we could take them in that order, and please, Councillor Hands.
Yeah, thanks, Provost. Again, try to take the politics out of it. I think Councillor Speed has shown over the last 4 years the value that she's brought to that role, both as the chair and also in the deputy role. And I think for consistency, it just doesn't make any sense removing her now just because of her being out of the administration. I listened to what Councillor Fairweather said in terms of the influence on the budget. I can't understand the argument, and I might be missing something in terms of it's still the administration that's looking and will set the budget. The papers recommending the budget for the IGB are drawn up by officers and are agreed at the IGB meetings. So that one person in the vice convener role hasn't got any different position, whether they're a member of the administration or not. And I think I take on board the comments made as well about Councillor Miles, and yes, he's got a lot of experience to bring as well, and the fact his work a representative on NHS board is valid. But I think we all know the contribution that Councillor Speed has brought with the lived experience relating to health and social care and the need for that. I think it would be a sad, sad, sad state of affairs if we tried to let politics come in here and totally ignore the value of the real life lived experience, because for all too often, people have told people that are needing health and social care services, this is what you're getting. I think what you get with Councillor Speed is an understanding, a true lived understanding of what it is people need, because she listens, she talks, and then she acts. I would think it'd be a really, really sad situation if Councillor Speed was removed today.
Okay, thank you very much for that comment, Councillor Hand. The next one, Mr. McCaskill.
Councillor Devine and then Councillor Speed. Councillor MacDonald.
Thanks, Provost. I would reiterate so much of what Councillor Hans has just said, and I think it is absolutely important that we have a sense of continuity. But, you know, also when Councillor Fairweather talks about the budget, we have to be proud that the Angus IGB is one of the best performing in Scotland. And that is very much up to the people who have been chair and vice chair. And so Councillor Speed deserves, I think, to be still in that position.
Thank you very much, Councillor Devine. Was it Councillor MacDonald next, was it?
It was Councillor Speed, Provost.
Councillor Speed, sorry.
I'm happy to let Councillor MacDonald go first if...
No, you crack on. You just I put the names in the wrong order. Right, you crack on, Councillor Speed.
Okay, thank you, Provost. Yeah, I can confirm that I did have a conversation with Councillor Fairweather this morning, and I did say that I wanted to stay on the board, and I also wanted to stay within my convenership roles as vice convener on children and learning and the IGB. But, you know, as Councillor Fairweather has already stated, he gave his reasons as to why he didn't think that was possible. I thank my colleagues around the table today for their support and their kind words. I'm thankful for my appointment and role within the convenership of the IGB, both as chair and vice chair. It has been a huge honour and privilege to serve, and I believe I've handled many challenges and issues, as well as ensure many successful outcomes for the residents of Angus. I've chaired the board throughout the pandemic, and I'm fully aware of the impact that this has had on the health and well-being of all our population, as well as the increase in demand and pressures that have been placed upon our health and social care workforce. I believe it's crucial as we move into the recovery phase that the IGB and Health and Social Care Partnership has continuity in its governance, scrutiny and challenge, and someone who can ensure the voices of those with lived experience and those who rely on health and social care support and services are indeed empowered to shape and influence those services. I very much want to put myself forward as Vice Chair of the IGB. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you very much. Councillor Speed, Councillor MacDonald.
Can't really follow up with much more than what Councillor Speed just said there. There's a year to go, effectively, of this council. And it would seem absolutely bizarre to make that change now, in my view. I appreciate what Councillor McMullen Douglas has said about Councillor Miles. But it's difficult to say that Councillor Miles was a good leader when the administration removed him as leader. That's just a fact 2-3 years ago. So it's not about getting political this, but it's just making the point that we have got a very competent setup with the IJB as it is now. Nobody's contesting anything else. I can fully understand why in the positions that Councillor Speed had within the administration, that the administration would want to hold on to them. But for the IJB, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. So, I think that Councillor Speed's done a good job. I appreciate the work that she's done, and along with her colleagues on the IJB, and I would just ask people to support Councillor Speed in this particular one.
Thank you very much. Anyone else, Mr.
Yes, Provost. Councillor Davey.
Okay, Councillor Davey, thank you.
And Councillor Whiteside.
Councillor Whiteside, thank you.
Thank you, Provost. It was just, to put on record my respect for the work that Councillor Speed has done over her time, as being a councillor. I think, unfortunately, Councillor Speed made the decision to, leave the administration, and I think these were administration positions, and I think that is, obvious how it flows. And I think we've talked about, taking the political out of it. And I think that's really important because, I vividly remember when Councillor Speed joined the administration, the level of abuse that was directed towards herself. I mean, Councillor Duff said she'd sold herself out for the Tory shilling, and that's on public record. And I think, I think we need to take that out and just, be aware of the work that has been done from Councillor Speed, which I've always had huge respect for Councillor Speed, and Councillor Speed knows this. I've said this about her. So I am obviously disappointed that Councillor Speed has decided not to be in the administration, but I am confident that Councillor Miles will bring a wealth of experience to the role, which is an administration position, and that is why I would welcome Councillor Miles in this position.
Thank you very much. Councillor Whiteside.
Thank you, Provost. Yeah, I would like to just give my point of view, which is very similar to Councillor MacDonald's. Obviously, the council committees have a political balance, and that it is sad that Councillor Speed is losing her vice convenership of Children and Learning, but it's understandable in the circumstances. However, the removal of her as vice convener of the IJB leaves a sour taste in the mouth. I think we have to look to the best person to fulfil the role, and it saddens me to see that this is what's being proposed.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Whiteside. Any other comments? Mr. McCaskill?
Provost, no, there's no other hands showing. So if there's no other hands, then it's a summing up if Councillor Fairweather wishes, and then it's going to the vote. Right,
Councillor Fairweather?
Yes, I think there's been enough said. To be perfectly honest, take the politics out of it. When I've listened to some of these comments, politics certainly came into it from the opposition. I move to the vote, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCaskill.
Provost, just on a procedural note, Councillor Laurie has indicated he wished to speak, but Councillor Fairweather, as summing up of the motion that standing orders now dictated, we go to the vote.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Provost. The motion by Councillor Fairweather, seconded by Councillor Macmillan-Douglas, is to remove Councillor Speed as vice convener of the IJB. Request that the Chief Executive provide notice of this to the member and the IJB. The amendment by Councillor Bell, seconded by Councillor Cheap, is to retain Councillor Speed as vice convener of the IJB. Please vote motion or amendment. Provost.
Motion.
Deputy Provost.
Motion.
Councillor Bell.
Amendment.
Councillor Boyd.
Amendment.
Councillor Braze.
Amendment.
Councillor Brown. Councillor Brown.
I don't believe that.
I will continue with the roll call vote. Provost. Councillor Cheap.
Amendment.
Councillor Davey.
Motion.
Councillor Devine.
Amendment.
Councillor Duff.
Amendment.
Councillor Durno.
Amendment. My computer's playing up. I'm going to probably have to go off and come back on. It's making an awful noise.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Durno. Councillor Fairweather.
Motion.
Councillor Hands.
Amendment.
Councillor King. Councillor King.
That's it. I couldn't get unmuted for a minute there. Amendment.
Okay. Councillor Lorry.
Amendment.
Councillor Macmillan Douglas.
Sorry, apologies. Motion.
Thank you. Councillor MacDonald.
Amendment.
Councillor McLaren.
Motion.
Councillor Moore.
Motion.
Councillor Miles.
Motion.
Councillor Nicholl.
Motion.
Councillor Salmond.
Motion.
Councillor Speed.
Amendment.
Councillor Stewart.
Motion.
Councillor Sturrock.
Motion.
Councillor Wan.
Motion.
And Councillor Whiteside.
Amendment.
Provost, we have an equality of votes. If Councillor Brown wishes to indicate prior to the vote being called, what is he opposing? Motion or amendment?
Motion.
With that, the motion is carried by 14 votes to 13, Provost.
Okay. Right, we can now move on to the next motion.
Thank you, Provost. Right, I move that Councillor Miles be appointed the Vice Convener of the Integration, the Integration Joint Board.
And I second that motion, please, Provost.
Amendment?
I don't see any hands showing, Provost. Yes, I do now. Councillor Bell, Councillor Miles.
Well, have we not covered that? Can I reiterate my amendment to nominate Councillor Speed?
Yeah. And the second there, Councillor Bell.
Provost, could I just say, in terms of a point of order, the council has agreed to remove Councillor Speed as vice chair, so that decision that holds and is extant for 6 months. So any amendment to propose to reinstate Councillor Speed would not comply with the 6-month rule.
Okay. So the motion is that Councillor Miles be appointed Vice Convener of the Integration Joint Board, which is duly proposed and seconded.
Provost, we have Councillor Miles wishing to speak.
Councillor Miles.
Yes, Provost. It was just to thank Councillor Speed very much for all the work in convening the Integrated Joint Board over the past years and in the vice convenership, and look forward to working very closely for the rest of the period on the IJB. We've always worked well as a team and will continue to do so. And just to correct Councillor MacDonald, I stepped down from leadership administration and moved on to the Health Board. The Health Board, Tayside Health Board, was in quite a serious position when I moved in. It has now turned the corner in considerably as far as both financial and otherwise. And I feel I've played some part in that. Thank you.
But to go on me, the motion put up there by Councillor Fairweather, any amendments?
Provost, Councillor Speed wishes to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just to speak. It wasn't for any further amendments. Is that okay, Provost?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, it was just to give thanks for everybody for their support today, and I do look forward to working with all colleagues on the Children and Learning Committee and indeed the IJB board. And you know, you can take away my positions in terms of convenerships, but I think what you'll never be able to take away is my passion and my determination and my commitment to fight for the best outcomes for the residents of Angus, for those children right through to older people, to ensure that they receive the best possible supports and services, and I look forward to continuing with my work on behalf of my constituency and indeed the wider population. So thank you, Provost.
Thank you very much, Councillor Speed. But to get back to the motion, we have no amendment, to my knowledge, Mr. McCaskill. So is the motion agreed?
Provost, we still have Councillors Boyd and Fairweather have indicated they wish to speak.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see their hand.
And Councillors Bell now, I think. Yes.
Okay, Councillor Boyd, on you go.
Well said, Councillor Lewis Speed. So sad to see what's happened to you. This intimidation and bullying has carried on for the last 9 years with my good self.
Point of order. Point of order. That is absolutely disgraceful, right?
No, it's you that's the disgraceful one. It's nice to see that you can come and be, and it's wonderful to see the two independents, the fake independents, coming forth and shouting and bawling down the screens. But you're more than welcome to come and join us, Lois, as one of the real independents, and give the constituents that voted for you, giving them on the tin what you said you would do, rather than joining any political party. An independent should remain independent. But well done, Lois, for all the work you've done, and you deal with these things a lot more professionally or calmly than I do. But well done, Lois.
Thank you very much, Councillor Boyd. Councillor Fairweather.
Right, yeah, thank you, Provost. Right, when we get comments like that from Councillor Boyd, playing to the gallery, right, as per usual, I despair. I spoke with Councillor Speed this morning and said, you know this, I was not looking forward to this meeting because that's exactly what would happen. And there it is, there he goes again, off at a tangent, with, right, as usual, as far as I'm concerned, a load of nonsense. But what I will say now is, thank you, Lois, because we had a good conversation this morning. I have said that I will work with you and continue to work with you. The work you have done has been absolutely exemplary. And I'm sure that I have given you a promise today that we will continue to work together, and I will not go back to write the silly comments that I have just heard from another councillor from Carnoustie. Thank you.
Very much. Mr. McCaskill, anybody else?
Yes, Councillor Bell.
All right, sorry, Councillor Bell.
Thank you. I would just like to ask the Provost if we could either go to a roll call or if my dissent from the motion could be recorded, please.
Yeah, well, that's what I was about to say. We've got no amendment to that. If we can vote on it, is that the correct procedure, Mr. McCaskill, that those wishing to record dissent may do so?
Yes, Provost. There is no amendment, but standing orders currently allow members, in the absence of a vote, to record their dissent if they so wish.
So those who wish to record their dissent, please do so. But other than that, please continue.
I record my dissent.
As do I.
Ditto.
I too.
As do I.
I record my dissent.
I record my dissent, and I missed most of what was going on because my computer was about to blow up. But if Lewis is no longer going to be on IGB, I think it's very sad, and there's going to be a hell of a lot of work for somebody else to do.
Point of clarification, no, she is still going to be on IGB.
Yeah.
Right.
I seem to have lost my icon, but I wish to record my dissent.
Okay, thanks very much, Councillor
Also
King.
wish to record my dissent.
Right.
Happy to record my dissent, Provost.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bill.
I think you've probably got my dissent there too. Don't
Yes, Provost, thank you. I've got everybody covered. Thank you.
Okay. As there were no amendment and dissent has been recorded, for those who wish to do so, the motion is moved. We now move on to the next motion, and that is that to remove Councillor Speed from Cosla Health and Social Care Board. Councillor Fairweather.
Yes, right. Right. You've just said it for me, Provost. Thank you.
And I second that, Provost.
Comments?
Councillor MacDonald, Provost, wishes to speak.
Thank you very much.
Apologies, that's a legacy hand.
Okay. Any other comments?
Move that it's agreed.
Agreed.
Councillor Sheep.
I was going to just say in two words, I just despair completely. 3 words.
But the motion has been agreed. Right, motion number 6. Councillor Fairweather.
I'm going to move the nomination of Councillor Miles to the Cosla Health and Social Care Board.
It's done.
Seconder.
Seconded. Yes, seconded, Provost.
Any amendments?
Provost, Councillor Whiteside, are you indicating you wish to speak?
Go on, Mr. McCarthy.
Sorry, I thought we were moving on to the next item.
We're on motion number 6 to nominate Councillor Miles to the Cosla Health and Social Care Board.
Agreed.
Agreed. And the motion number 7 is to remove Councillor Laurie from the Cosla Children and Young Persons Board as a substitute.
Provost, right, as it's my motion, can I just say that again? I move the removal of Councillor Laurie from Cosla Children and Young Persons Board, but only as a substitute. And I did have a conversation with Councillor Laurie yesterday, and I will again reiterate that I have made sure that we will be able to work going forward in the future. It's only as a substitute. We already have the convener and the vice convener as a substitute. It was something that the administration put in when we asked Ben to work with us for children and young persons as a spokesperson. And I am quite sure he will continue to do that and work with myself and the administration. Thank you.
I second that, Provost.
Thank you. Any comments? Report agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed, right. We can move on now to agenda item number 6. Use of delegated powers and further proposals. And the report is by Mr. Lorimer. You can see the recommendations there. Any comments, any questions?
Nobody's indicating that they wish to speak, Provost.
Nothing come up? Okay. Are we agreed then in the recommendations to note number 1 and 2 and approve the proposed use of COVID-19 funding for an urgent purpose as set out in section 6 and table 2 of this report?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. Item number 7, which is the revised Common Good Fund Policy Guidelines and Administrative Procedure. I'm now going to call on Mr. Lorimer to give colleague a brief on and explain what's written down in the paper. Mr. Lorimer.
Thank you, Provost, and good afternoon, councillors. If I could ask for colleagues in business support just to share the screen. Just give that a minute or two. Can folks see that?
Yeah.
Just needs to be put on full screen. That's it's good to go. Thank you. Yeah, this is an important report. We felt it's quite I guess a complex subject, so we felt it was useful to kind of pick out the main points as part of a presentation to council today. So just in terms of the background, you'll recall from last year, there was a Court of Session decision in relation to Lochside Leisure Centre. Arising from that and the decision not to appeal that court outcome, we advised that there would need to be changes to the council's existing common good accounting arrangements and policy. So that's what this report is effectively looking to do today. Now, just as a reminder again, in terms of background, common good funds, we have 5. Although we refer in the report to and in the policy to common good as a kind of singular thing, we do actually have 5 common good funds covering each of the former boroughs, or 5 of those former boroughs. So the important thing there is that we don't have a common good that covers all parts of Angus, and that's really just I guess a quirk of history, but that's the position. In contrast, the general fund. Now, the general fund is where we record pretty much all of the transactions of the council in terms of expenditure and income. That is Angus wide, so it affects all council taxpayers and all rent payers, and that's important in terms of the relationship between the 2 funds. The common good is what is called vested in the council. So what that means is that as councillors and indeed as officers, we have best value duties to both the general fund and the stakeholders there, and the common good fund. So there's a dual role there, as I say, for yourselves as elected members in terms of considering issues as they affect common good and general fund. One of the things we've really sought to do through the policy is get something that is fair and balanced from both a general fund perspective and a common good fund, that tries to strike the balance between the responsibilities, the different responsibilities that the council has. If I could ask for the next slide, please. Thank you. So just a reminder again in terms of the court decision. We have, and indeed some of the predecessor councils have built buildings on common good land, but paid for by the general fund. So an example of that, and it's not the only example, would be Lochside Leisure Centre. So historically, buildings such as that have been treated as being a part of the general fund, an asset on the general fund balance sheet. For the building, the land has always been a common good asset. What the court decision from last year means is that both the building and the land are both common good assets. So that's quite a significant change in terms of the kind of historic position. And that historic position has existed for a long time, probably decades in many respects. So what we said we would need to do is we need to change our existing accounting and administration arrangements so that we can be clear about the kind of relationship between common good and general fund. Now, the good news is we already had an existing common good policy. That's actually existed since 1996. So what we've been able to do really is update that existing policy to reflect the impact of the court case. If I could have the next slide, please. So really the rest of the presentation is about summarising the kind of main changes to the policy. So the council owns both common good and general fund assets, but we are required in terms of the legislation and the accounting practice to record those and account for those separately. So we need to do that. The purpose of the policy, therefore, is really largely to provide more clarity than the existing policy had around how we will manage that relationship between common good and general fund. I mentioned in terms of the background that these are both things that the council has responsibility for, but we need to manage the relationship between the 2 funds because they do need to be treated separately. We need to manage that relationship and be clear about how we would do that. Within paragraph 5.1 of the report, we've set out 5 key principles that have guided us in terms of how we've developed the policy and what the policy has been based on. In practice, and this was to some extent a surprise to us as we got into the detail of this following the court decision, but in practice, there's actually relatively limited changes have been required to our existing policies and arrangements. And I think that's really a reflection of the fact that the existing policy was reasonably clear on most aspects of how the relationship works. And it's really the impact of the court case on how we account for these assets that has been the main change. If I get the next slide, please. Thank you. So what we've been seeking to do in terms of the policy revisions is answer the key questions that we've put on this slide. So what we're saying is where there is an interaction between the common good funds and the general fund on an asset, who's responsible for what? We need to be clear about that. More so now than ever in terms of the community empowerment legislation and the importance of community input to common good matters. We need to be clear about who pays for running costs, who pays for what we call demobilisation costs. That's an accounting term, I suppose. Really, that would mean the removal, demolition of an asset when it reaches the end of its life. What happens if circumstances change? We need to be clear on that as best we can. The court case is an example of how circumstances can change, even after many years of a particular approach to things. We need to be clear in the policy about what happens to those assets that have been directly impacted by the court case, where ownership has in effect changed. And we also need to, we've also sought to answer the question about what happens in the future if there's to be a new building built by the general fund for the purposes of service provision, and that there's a desire to build that building on common good land. So that's what we've sought to do as part of the policy. If you go on the next slide again, please. So we've really structured the policy around, or the policy revisions, the main policy revisions around 5 scenarios, rather than having a policy that's kind of abstract. We felt it was appropriate and sensible to build the policy around real life situations and real life examples, because that's what the policy would need to do. So we've got the 5 scenarios. They're all explained in detail in the report, but broadly speaking, what we're saying in scenario 1, buildings which have really always been part of the common good, or certainly as far as we can determine, they're used by the general fund operationally. We've given the example there of Montrose Townhouse, which is used, I think, as an access office provision. In those scenarios, the general fund is a tenant of the common good. So that's scenario 1. That's really not changed much since, or hasn't changed really as a result of the court case. Scenario 2 is where the general fund wishes to build a new building on common good land for general fund use. So let's say in the future there's a need to build a new school or something like that. The land that's available as common good land. What would happen? And we've sought to set that out in the policy. Scenario 3, and this is where we get into the impacts of the court case, is where we've got an operational building used for general fund purposes. The example I've given on this slide is Montrose Sports Centre. So that sports centre is now owned by the Common Good Fund of Montrose as a result of the court case. It's still an operational building. What happens in terms of the treatment and who pays for what in relation to that? Scenario 4 is really just only really affects Lochside Leisure Centre. It's similar to option 3, the difference being that it's no longer operational, no longer an operational building for general fund purposes. So we need to be clear about what happens with the buildings in that sort of scenario. And then item 5, scenario 5, is where it goes the other way. Occasionally, when we look at the detail of title, we find that common good buildings that we thought were common good perhaps should be reassessed and as owned by the general fund. So scenario 5, we've also set out within the policy what would happen with that. Now, critical within this, scenarios 2 and 3, as far as the policy is concerned, are identical. Although they're different in circumstance, what will happen in practice is identical. So within the report, we've got 5 scenarios, but within the policy itself in Appendix B to the report, we've combined those. So there's only 4 scenarios actually need to be detailed within the policy. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as I said, scenario one, we've got a few examples of this arrangement where the general fund's the tenant, and there's no impact of the court case in relation to that. So we don't have to make any policy changes. So that means the general fund would pay a commercial rent for the land and the building. That's quite important in terms of land and building. General fund would meet the running costs, pay for what's that we've referred there to as dilapidation. So if there's wear and tear, if any point the general fund was to move out as a tenant, as you would have in a commercial arrangement, usually a commercial lease, then the general fund would pay for those. Because the building and indeed the land in this scenario is owned and always has been by the common good, the common good would be responsible for the costs of asset demobilisation if at some future point there was a need to remove a building or whatever because it had got to the end of its life. In this, we've mentioned transfer period within the policy. There's no need for a transfer period in relation to scenario one. If we could have the next slide, please. I've brought together scenarios 2 and 3 because, as I say, they're identical really in terms of how they would operate in practice. Now, there's actually limited change to existing practice required in these scenarios, and that's reflected in the policy. So in these scenarios, the general fund would pay a commercial rent for the land only, just for a rent of the land. That already happens across a number of different common good assets and has done for many years. The general fund would meet the running costs of those buildings. The common good fund for wherever the building sits, let's say it's in Forfar, the Forfar common good, or members, when they're considering the future of a building, would decide whether that building is to be retained by the common good. So the common good own those buildings now, if they're built on common good land. So the common good, with your common good hats on as councillors, you would need to make a decision about whether those buildings would be retained, sold, demolished. But the crucial part of that is that it's a decision from a common good perspective that would be made. If there were to be dilapidation repairs, the common good would pay for those. That would only arise, I think, if the common good wished to retain the building for either sale or for letting on to another tenant. The general fund would be responsible for asset demobilisation. So if a building had been used for general fund operational purposes over a long period of years, it had reached the end of its life, although the building's on common good land, the proposal is the general fund would pay for the removal and demolition of that, if that was the option that was chosen from a common good point of view. Now, we are proposing within the policy to have a transfer period of up to 1 year, so a maximum of a year, where the general fund ceases to use a building on common good land for operational purposes. That is really to provide a period where decisions about the future of the building can be made, and that's really a reflection of the need where common good assets are concerned to go through a process of consultation in line with the Community Empowerment Act, etc. So that gives a period of up to a year to make a decision about that. We'll go on the next slide, please. Scenario 4. This is, again, limited change actually to what our existing practice and approach is. Slight difference here would be because the building would no longer be used operationally by the general fund. There would be no ground rent paid during that period. General fund would continue to meet the running costs during the 1 year or up to 1 year transfer period. But similar to options 2 and 3, common good needs to decide on the future of the building, whether to retain, sell, demolish. If there were to be dilapidation repairs to be made, those would be payable by the common good. Similarly to options scenarios 2 and 3, general fund would be responsible for demobilisation, asset demobilisation costs, if that was the option that was ultimately chosen. I've mentioned here a transfer period of up to 1 year. If the general fund ceases to use for operational purposes, that's the same. Now, we've only got one asset that's that falls into this scenario at the moment, and that's Lochside Leisure Centre. The transfer period could arguably have started in September last year, because that was the point at which the council decided not to appeal the court decision. That was the point at which it was therefore clear that the Lochside Leisure Centre was a common good asset. However, because this policy wasn't in place at that point, and we said in September we would need to bring back a policy, we think it's reasonable to have the transfer period, which we're referring in the report as a transition period of 12 months, for that period to start effectively from today. As I say, that only affects Lochside Leisure Centre as the only example of an asset in that situation. So effectively a year from today would be the transfer period. If we go on the next slide, please. Scenario 5, again, limited changes to existing practice. This is where it's effectively an asset's been identified as currently common good and it should be general fund. And we've just outlined there how that would play out in terms of who would pay for what. And we've actually got an existing accounting policy that recognises that this type of scenario can unfold, and that we would continue to apply that policy. So that's all of that for scenario 5. Next slide, please. Now, best will in the world, although we think the policy is robust, it can't possibly, foresee all future issues and circumstances. We do think there might be situations where the policy, as the basic policy, might need to be flexed, or it might be advantageous to flex that policy. If doing so would provide best value, and crucially would be fair from both a common good and a general fund perspective. Now that might be quite tricky to judge in circumstances, but we think it's reasonable that the policy build in the flexibility to look at that on a case-by-case basis. So within Appendix A to the report, there's a number of notes that set out what we think the policy flexibilities would be or could be. We've given a couple of examples of that. Note 1, what we were saying in relation to a number of the scenarios is that the common good would pay for dilapidation costs, but there might be a scenario where it would be appropriate for those dilapidation costs to be met by the general fund, if that was a more cost-effective alternative to demobilisation. So if, for example, it made sense to spend 50,000 on dilapidation repairs to an asset to avoid the cost of demolishing the asset, then that might still be regarded as a best value approach. We would have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. We would have to do an options appraisal. We would have to look at that through the eyes of both general fund and common good. But what I'm saying, of what's proposed within the policy, is that the flexibility to look at that would be available. Similarly, in terms of note 2, there could be a scenario where it would make sense and would be mutually beneficial from both a general fund and a common good point of view to extend the transfer period. That might be an example where we're just about there in terms of concluding a sale or a relet of a building, and it would make sense to extend that period rather than again incur potentially more significant costs from demobilisation. And then the last example of flexibility we've provided was where it may be appropriate. Generally speaking, we've said within the policy, if there's a need to invest in an asset, the general fund would pay for that. But there might be examples, and there have been examples in the past, where the common good would benefit from making a contribution if, for example, that was to extend significantly the asset life of the asset. So we're not ruling out that as a possibility as one of the flexibilities. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. A few other things in terms of policy changes, just to summarise. Third-party use of common good land and buildings, no change. Those are generally on commercial terms. So occasionally the common good will rent out land or buildings to third parties. Those arrangements would continue. We've made changes to officer designations. We've tidied up the language, etc., within the policy. Those are all fairly minor changes. We've also introduced a need to do 3-year budgeting for common good funds. And that's really to give members who consider the common good fund budgets a bit more information about what might be coming down the track. And as part of that, we'll also have longer term maintenance obligations set out, because the policy requires the maintenance of existing assets to be given priority for the money that is available within the common good. And we've also built in, and this is now in standing orders from a council decision last year, but the requirement to consult local members on the future of buildings on common good land. So we've captured all of those different things within the revised policy. If we go on the next slide, thanks. A few other matters. Some of these are pretty technical, folks. So they're there more for background as much as anything else. We have raised within the report in paragraph 520 an alternative rental approach. So it's not something we're recommending, but we felt it was appropriate to set that out. You could take a view that where the general fund is using a building on common good land, that it should pay for the land as well as the building. We don't think that's fair or reasonable if the general fund is paid for the building to be put there in the first place and is maintaining it and covering all the running costs. Mentioned the balance sheet transfers, quite a significant sum of increased value to the common good funds. And there's a breakdown, I think, in Appendix C to the report of which common good funds would have that increase in value based on the assets that will transfer. We've mentioned depreciation, and this is where we're getting into the really technical stuff. That's mentioned because it's relevant to the change in valuations for the common good funds. So the depreciation charges to common good will go up. However, this was an action from last year's external audit. We needed to change our accounting treatment of that to comply with the necessary standards. And we think we have a solution on that, which will enable the impact of depreciation not to have an effect on the common good balances that are available for use. So I thought it was appropriate to mention that. We've got this thing coming down the track called IFRS 16, that's International Financial Reporting Standard 16. That we think is likely to change the accounting arrangements here again, because we look at the substance of the nature of the relationship. So we're really just mentioning that because we may come back in a couple of years' time and advise of a change. We don't think at this stage that would change the policy. I think the policy will be okay in relation to that. It's likely to just affect the accounting arrangements and which balance sheets the assets are set on. In terms of financial impact, because there's relatively limited change to the policy, which we think is required, the impact is broadly neutral apart from the transfer of asset values. And that, for that reason, we're not proposing any prior year adjustments because we don't think those are necessary in this instance. Next slide. This all started really from the position in relation to Lochside Leisure Centre and the court decision. So it's appropriate to just spend a couple of minutes on what does all this mean for Lochside Leisure Centre. It's important to see Lochside Leisure Centre. It's only one of the assets that's affected. So we've based the policy on the principles and how this will affect all assets, not just looked at through the lens of Lochside, but we've clarified and we know certainly the policy is clear in terms of what would happen with Lochside. Lochside Leisure Centre, as you know, is now owned by the Forfar Common Good Fund. What we're proposing in terms of the policy, the transition period in relation to that asset would begin today. So up to a year from today for a final decision to be made on that particular asset. And during that transition period, the general fund would be responsible for the running costs and the asset demobilisation costs if ultimately that option is chosen. During that transition period for that asset, with a Forfar Common Good hat on, there needs to be a decision made as to the future of the building. that building, if it's to be retained, would be a common good. Common good would be fully responsible for Lochside from May 2022. So that's what would happen in relation to that based on the policy. We could have the next slide. Just the final slide really to summarise. We had an existing policy, we had an existing approach. That's provided us with a really solid base from which to make the revisions following the court decision. So that was a good place to start from. In practice, and probably a bit of a surprise once, as I say, we got into the detail of it, in practice, we actually need to make limited changes to our existing arrangements. The policy revisions, really, it's less about accounting and more about just the relationship and how we manage the relationship and responsibilities between general fund and common good. And much of the policy is therefore geared towards providing that clarity and that transparency. And as I mentioned earlier, that's really important in light of the community empowerment legislation and the duties on the council that apply in relation to common good assets under the legislation. We felt it was important that the policy, recognised the need, as we've said there in the slide, to avoid a sudden change in responsibility and liability for costs. The court decision meant overnight there was a change of ownership in relation to a number of assets, and that's why we think it's appropriate to have transfer and transition periods as proposed in the policy to give a little bit of time for the effects of these changes to come forward. And as I've said, the policy can be flexed where it's sensible and fair to do so, and that's where, as councillors, you might have to make decisions where you're trying to find the right balance between what's fair from a common good point of view and what's fair from a general fund point of view. That was all I wanted to say, Provost. If we could stop sharing and I guess just open it up for questions at that point. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Mr. Lorimer. A lot to take in there. Questions, comments? I think Councillor Duff, I see a question coming from you. Mr. McCaskill, can you maybe just show me the hands if we've got any
Yes,
questions?
Provost. In terms of the order, it's Councillor Miles, then Devine, then Moore, Davy and Braze so far.
Okay. Right, carry on. Councillor Miles.
Yes, thank you, Provost. And again, thank you, Ian. A very complex situation, and you've explained it fairly well. Can I first of all ask, this obviously affects common goods right across the country. Are we aware of any knowledge of how other councils are dealing with these changes to the common good policy? Because I do think ones that thought that the buildings were retained by either council or others still belong to them and not the common good will have repercussions elsewhere. And second point, and I do like the last point, the flexibility when dealing with the situation, but an instance where a common good lets a property on less than the commercial rent, i.e. like a peppercorn rent, how is it expected to then maintain it? Or is there a possibility the general fund could pick up some of the maintenance and costs if it's given to a body on a less than commercial rent? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Miles. Through you, Provost. Yeah, in terms of the impact elsewhere, common good is one of those real oddities. It's very specific to Scotland, and actually has existed for something like 500 years, going all the way back to an act in 1491. So what's happened over the years, and various local government reorganisations, etc., have happened, is that different councils have approached their kind of policies and accounting arrangements to a degree differently. Now, when the court case came through last year, we flagged that this might have repercussions not just for Angus but for other councils, and I think that remains the position. And I know it's something that Audit Scotland have an eye on. But different councils are in different starting positions in relation to common good. So it's difficult to know what would happen elsewhere, depending on what starting positions they have. And what I would say is that the policy, the existing policy that we have, and the revisions to the policy that have been made, I think are based on a sound logic and approach. Gives the transparency and clarity that I've mentioned we were seeking to do, and we think we've got an answer in terms of the depreciation arrangements, which I do know is used elsewhere in Scotland. So that one's a difficult one. Each council has its own individual arrangements, and I've certainly flagged it through my professional networks for colleagues elsewhere to consider what they may wish to do. In terms of the second point of the question about common good lets at a commercial or less than commercial rental level, that would need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So that the common good funds, there's quite wide discretion actually in what common good funds can be used for. But we have to have regard to the inhabitants. It's for the benefit of the inhabitants of the area. So it wouldn't be unreasonable for the common good if it felt that providing a subsidised rent for a particular purpose was for the benefit of the inhabitants of the area to do that. If it was something where a council general fund service was looking to seeking out to use a common good building at a discount to support something that's part of the council's wider responsibilities, then there could be a scenario where the use of general fund to effectively pay the difference between the subsidised rent and a commercial rent, that may be regarded as appropriate. It have to be reviewed or considered on a case-by-case basis. But I say that the common good could provide subsidised rent if that was for the benefit of the inhabitants of the area. I think hopefully that answers those two questions, Provost.
Thank you, Mr. Lorber.
Right, thank you. Next question, please, Mr. McCaskill.
It's Councillor Devine, then Councillor Moore.
Okay.
Thanks, Provost. I'm glad to hear that it wasn't quite as difficult a task as you thought it was going to be, Mr. Lorimer, but it's still very complex, and I do appreciate your explanation today, but I do need to get a little bit of clarity just in my own head, because at one point it says, I think it was in your maybe second last slide, it said that from May 2022, the common good would be fully responsible. And then in another place, it says about demolition that would be not common good, but general fund. For how long would that be? And presumably that would need to have the money still in the coffer, in the budget of the council. I'm just concerned that in the future, no matter what happens to the leisure centre at the moment, in the future, it will need to be demolished. It could be 20 years, but is the Common Good Fund going to have to deal with that?
Thank you, Councillor Devine, again through you, Provost. Yeah, if I deal with the position generally first, and then we can come to Lochside. So in general terms, there would be a transfer period of 1 year on an asset that reaches where the general fund is no longer requiring to use it. And during that year, a decision needs to be made as to what would happen with that. If the decision is to retain the building, then the common good is liable moving forward for the running costs, any maintenance of the building, and if and when it came to the point, asset demobilisation, demolition. So that would be the point. That would be the point generally. In relation to Lochside Leisure Centre, what we're saying is over the next year or up to a year, there would need to be a decision made as to what the future of the centre is. If the conclusion of that, and it would be a council decision, is demolition, then the general fund would pay for that, and there's a budget in place to do that. If the decision was to retain the building and sell it or lease it on to another party, then that could also happen. But once that decision is made, if at some future point, let's say the building was leased, at some future point or from that point onwards, the common good would be responsible for the future of the building. Now, it's okay if there was a lease in place, because usually the lessee would be responsible for running costs and the like. But in terms of if it got to a position where it required demolition, then the common good fund would be responsible for that. So what that means is that the general fund is not obligated to meet those costs once a decision has been reached from a common good perspective as to what the future of the building would be. So hopefully that answers that question, Councillor Devine.
Happy with that?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. McCaskill, next one.
Yes, Councillor Moore, followed by Councillor Davey.
Thank you, Provost. Yes, thank you, Mr. Lorimer. A very clear and concise explanation of something that I know is somewhat complicated. I've got two questions on it. In scenario 2 and 3, if the general fund has been paying out because the service is in the building and the service leaves, I'm just wondering why the Common Good Fund has to meet such spend as is necessary to enable sale or relet. If the service has damaged the building or not kept the building up, why should the Common Good have to pay out instead of the service?
Trying to get myself off mute there. Thank you, Councillor Moore. Through you again, Provost. Yeah, so what we're saying is that during the life of a building in scenarios 2 and 3, the general fund would meet all the running costs. The general fund would have paid for the creation of the asset, would have paid for the building. So Montrose Sports Centre as an example, Common Good, the general fund would have paid for that building at the time. So when the building reaches the end of its life or its operational, the operational need for that building from a general fund perspective, the general fund would in effect walk away, but subject to the transfer period of 1 year. And during that period, the Common Good Fund needs to make a decision as to what the future of the building is. If from a Common Good Fund perspective, the decision is we want to retain the building, to let it or to sell it, that is a common good decision. And so the logic is that the general fund would not pay for those costs because it's a decision that the common good is making for itself.
Right,
However,
okay.
in terms of the policy flexibilities, what we've said is there could be a scenario where, from a general fund perspective, it would be more cost effective to pay for things like dilapidation repairs rather than bear the cost of demolition. So although the policy sets out a particular position, there may be scenarios where it would be still provide best value from both a common good and general fund perspective to vary away from that policy.
Thank you. And just on the transfer period, in scenarios 2 and 3, it states, it can go on. I'm just concerned that you've said that if the building is relet by the Common Good Fund, say 10, 20 years down the line it needs demolishing, that is a common good, the common good having to pay for it rather than the general fund, which puts in my mind that it would be an automatic default position when a building reaches the end of its life to say, let's demolish it in the transition period, because the common good funds don't necessarily have the money in order to pay for the demolition, especially as they are required to keep a minimum balance. So this worries me. It's, how do I put it? It concerns that the Common Good Fund is making itself hostage to fortune if it decides to relet rather than demolish. Is that a correct assumption?
I think each case, again through you, Provost, each case would need to be looked at on its merit. So you could have a scenario where, for operational reasons, the general fund vacates a building, but it's a building that's got, you know, another 50, 60, 70 years of life in it and would be easily relet. In that scenario, it may well make good sense from a common good perspective to you know, retain the building and allow it to move on. But there is a risk, and you've flagged it there, Councillor Moore. Councillor Devine, I think, was kind of along similar lines, where once the decision has been made as to whether to retain or otherwise a building in these circumstances, once that decision's made, the future arrangements and costs of the building would then be for the common good fund to meet. So that would be part of the consideration that members would have to weigh up when the decision about buildings are made in the future. It's probably relatively rare for general fund services to vacate buildings that they currently use. It's not something that happens all that often, particularly where common good land is involved. But where that is the case, then those various issues would need to be thought about and weighed up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are you happy with that, Councillor Moore?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Davey?
Thank you, Prof. I have two questions and then also a comment for later. When you've been describing, obviously, these decisions, Mr. Orme, you've been saying, you know, the common good will need to decide whether it chooses to retain or demolish the building. However, you know, very obviously with Lochside, it wasn't a common good decision. It was a decision of full council. So I'm struggling to understand the interaction between the decision of a common good and the decision of full council. For example, when we decide whether to approve funding requests or not, usually full council will just, or P&R will just either agree with the ward members. But obviously now the decision of common good members could have quite significant financial liabilities on full council. And also the decision of full council could have quite significant financial liabilities on common good. And it wouldn't be past the realms of possibility where you could have a council in the future with no ward members with a common good decide one thing to happen. So I'm just wondering, when you say it's a decision for common good, is that we would meet as four for common good members and we would say, this is what we want to do. That would then go to full council to approve? Or is it more, it's actually a decision of full council, which takes into consideration what the four for common good members? I'm really struggling to get the interaction between common good and full council clear in my mind, because in your replies, you've mentioned quite a lot. It's a common good decision, but on Lochside, that hasn't been the case. And my understanding is it won't be a common good decision, the next steps with Lochside.
I'll answer that question first. I might need to bring in Mrs. Buchanan on this as well, because it is relevant in terms of our standing orders. I've perhaps not been overly helpful in saying that would be a common good decision. And just to clarify the arrangements, Mrs. Buchanan may wish to kind of reiterate this or correct anything I get wrong here. But the custom and practice has been for local members to be consulted on decisions that affect the individual common good funds. So that's been the custom and practice. But the standing orders and the legal position, as I understand it, is that the formal decisions that are made either by the Policy and Resources Committee or the Council. So when I talk about that would be a decision for the common good, what I mean by that is that would be a decision for either Policy and Resources or full council, where the councillors are wearing their common good hat at the time. And this is where it becomes really quite tricky, because as councillors, as I said on the very first slide, you have dual responsibilities and dual roles here. And it's not difficult to see a scenario where that might create some obvious tensions and difficulties for yourselves as elected members. But it may be that Mrs. Buchanan would want to say a bit more than that on that particular question, Provost, in response to Councillor Davey.
Mrs. Buchanan.
Thank you, Provost. Not really. I think Ian's covered it. Mr. Lorimer's covered it well in terms of the decision sits with either P&R if they're taking the decision, or council if council's taking the decision. And as Mr. Lorimer mentioned, there is a provision in our standing orders that allow a view to be taken, a consultation in effect to be taken with the local members in terms of that. So that's how it sits.
Okay, thank you very much.
So just to, that's perfect. Thank you. So just to clarify, we could end up in a situation where common good members, and this could apply to anyone, I'm not thinking of anything specific. Say, for example, common good members in Montrose could decide one thing, but full council takes a different view, and therefore the decision of full council or P&R would go through.
Technically, it is full council or P&R's decision, and certainly they would take into account the views of the local members as provided for in standing orders.
Perfect. And my second question, sorry if I may, was within the report, there's obviously the notes about flexibility within that. And obviously, I think Councillor Moore has mentioned and Councillor Devine concerns about demolition costs. I'm just wondering if flexibility would extend so as far as, and obviously mutually agreed between the general fund and the common goods, if the liability for demolition will be taken on by the common good if they choose to use the building, can the demolition costs, or what the general fund would be paying to demolish, be transferred to the common good? Therefore, the common good takes on the liability and can use the building as it wishes.
Mr. Lorimer.
Thank you. Yeah, each case, as I've said, would need to be looked on its merits. We would need to look at the circumstances from both a common good fund perspective and a general fund perspective. But if we were satisfied, and if ultimately as members you were satisfied that your best value obligations to both general fund and common good could be satisfied from an arrangement like that, and providing we were comfortable that that was within the law, which I understand it to be, then yes, that could happen.
Okay. Are you satisfied, Councillor Davey?
Yeah. Yes, I am. Thank you. Thanks.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Yes, Provost, there's Councillors Braze, Hans, Duff, Bell and Sturrock.
Okay. Councillor Braze, when you go.
Yes, thank you, Provost. Yes, I welcome this report. It's pretty heavy going, but I think it's quite remarkable that Mr. Lorimer and his team have managed to come up with something that's intelligible from such a complex set of circumstances. You may remember that at the budget setting meeting last year, I asked for much more detailed budgets for common good funds. So I'm very pleased that that's going to happen now. It's rather late coming, but I entirely understand why. We've had a global pandemic and a court ruling. So I think it's really good that we're going to get 3-year budgets. I actually think that we need further than that. I think we might need 5 and 10-year budgets, or at least partial budgets that show what big expenditures might be on the more intermediate horizon. Because common good funds tend to have a lot of old buildings that will from time to time require fairly massive expenditure. And it would be good to know just where about in the future that was likely to occur. So yes, I welcome this, and I would hope that we do get more longer term budgeting in the future. I would also say though that I think there's every possibility that we find ourselves revisiting this again in the future, this whole common good fund policy, because it's really complicated, and there's at least a fair chance that it's not going to be exactly what we want when we find ourselves actually implementing it in the years that lie ahead. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Brace. Councillor Bell.
Thanks, Provost. Thanks, Ian. I don't mind admitting it took me a few years to get into the paper. I think I got there eventually. I was wondering if there's any impact on our community asset transfer policy and any requirements for public consultation, not just legal but good practice, that fall out of this, and are there any gaps that have been created now that might need to be plugged by a review of the policy? Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Lorimer.
Thanks, Provost. I'm not sure I picked all of that up. There was a few words missing in what I heard, but in terms of community asset transfer applies to common good assets in the same way as it applies to other assets of the council. As Councillor Bell says, there is a process in terms of the Community Empowerment Act around consultation on on common good assets. So that would continue. In fact, we've actually had a couple of community asset transfers already, which have affected common good land, and we're going through that process. I think there was a part of the question was about legal and good practice, but I'm sorry, Councillor Bell, I missed out some of the words there, so I didn't fully understand what the question was.
It was just in terms of if there had been any anomalies between the common good and the community assets, about plugging those gaps and public consultation. So I think you've probably covered it for reassurance. Thanks.
I could add there, Provost, if it's helpful, there is, we do have, again, under the Community Empowerment Act, obligations to publish details, publish the register of our common good assets. That's a legal requirement, more so than best practice. And that's something that I think we will be bringing a report, Mrs. Buchanan will be bringing a report to council or committee in the very near future. That was in action from last year's external audit. So that work is in hand.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Larimer. Are you happy with that, Councillor Bell? Yeah. Okay. And we've now got Councillor Sturrock.
I've withdrawn my query, Provost. It's been answered by, on behalf of Councillors Devine and Moore. It was regarding demolition. I'm satisfied with the response I've heard. So I will withdraw my hand.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other comments?
That leaves Councillors Hands and Duff.
Councillor Hands.
Yeah, thanks, Provost. Mr. Lorimer, I'd like to come on to the issue about flexibility and the 12-month period, because listening to the presentation and also comments afterwards, I think, and I understand the approach about the flexibility, but I am concerned that it's releasing 3 spinning plates as a consequence of that, namely certainty, risk, and fairness, and you've covered that to a degree as well. I think in terms of the general fund, common good, and also interested third parties, my concern here is if we go with too much flexibility, one, it could just keep going on, but that introduction of uncertainty is also problematic, and it then becomes unfair for some people and some decisions that, but for something would have been extended or gone through. So I do think we have a concern here about consistency. I wonder whether we can look at 2 different time periods, one that would relate to purely common good assets that benefit, and any transfer of a building or a lease or whatever within the area that it just has an impact on that area, like the leisure, any of the leisure centres that have been mentioned. Whereas if it's a council service that's come out a common good area, a common good building that has a wider impact and has had a wider benefit for the Angus wide community, I can understand and I can get the issue there about the general fund potentially being liable to contribute more. But as an area, representing an area that doesn't have a common good fund, my concern is I wouldn't like to be issuing a blank cheque potentially to common good areas where people in that area, solely area, have benefited. So I do get the need for flexibility. I do wonder if we need to have two different timescales for that flexibility. And sorry, my door has just gone.
You still there, Councillor Hunt? You sorted your doggy out. Mr. Lorimer, I think mainly what you're trying to say was there might be a wee bit of imbalance. You might want to do something in one place and but something completely different in another. Do you want to maybe?
Yeah, thanks, Provost. I could hopefully maybe just provide a bit of reassurance. The proposal in the policy is what would apply. The flexibilities I would see being, used only where the circumstances merit that, and where there was, we were able to satisfy our best value obligations, both to taxpayers generally, so a general fund, and in terms of the common good, because I very much recognise, and it was why it was on one of the very first bullet points on the first slide. Common good funds do not cover all of Angus, and that means that we need to get something that is workable and fair, in relation to how those interactions work. So the policy would only be flexed where it is, I think I've used the words mutually beneficial, and where it could be. It was clear that it would be a best value, we'd be satisfying our best value obligations, both to general fund and common good. So there's certainly no intention, because I don't think it would be fair to taxpayers for there to be a blank cheque as far as any of those flexibilities were concerned. I didn't quite understand the point in relation to potentially different time periods. I think that would be something that would need to be looked at in more detail than we would be able to go into today. But happy to have a further conversation with Councillor Hands after the meeting in terms of that, Provost. So I don't know if that's answered all of the question, but hopefully that's been helpful.
Yeah, can I just come back a little bit on that? In terms of the timeframes, I think because if it's been a council service, it might be more problematic and the footprint of the building could be bigger, therefore the demolition costs could be higher. But I do also wonder whether, my concern here, there's an awful lot of subjectivity at play, and that creates uncertainty and potential unfairness. Just as we've got a scoring mechanism in the community asset transfer process, I wonder if there's a scoring matrix that could be created that then, certain elements are looked at, and according to the score that each individual case receives, then a decision to extend is taken, and then you've got more of a fair approach being taken. Whereas without having something that's more objective being applied here, I think there's an awful lot of subjectivity that could lead to some issues dragging on, just like we've already seen.
Mr. Lorimer, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks for that, Provost, and thanks, Councillor Hands, again for clarifying that. Yeah, so I think I possibly mentioned in one of the slides that the need to do an options appraisal if we were looking to apply the flexibilities, and we would look to use the as best as we could an objective assessment for that. Councillor Hands has mentioned the kind of approach we use in CAT. That may well be quite a useful means of looking at that, because the scoring arrangements in relation to CAT, community asset transfers, look at the kind of community benefit as well as the financial implications. So there's a model there that we could use, but we may wish to use other options. But all of those decisions where any flexibilities are to be applied would be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and we would have to be satisfied from both a general fund point of view and a common good fund point of view that we were meeting our best value obligations. So that those best value obligations are not to be taken lightly. Those are important legal requirements that are on the council and on how the council makes its decisions. So hopefully that provides a reassurance that there would, if flexibilities are to be applied, they would be applied in a robust fashion and subject to reporting to members for approval.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lorimer. Councillor Hand, are you happy with that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Lorimer.
Okay, thank you very much. And Councillor Duff.
Yeah, thanks, Provost. I mean, my question, I think, was kind of touched by Councillor Davies' question, but I just want to clarify my own understanding. Mr. Lorimer said that the common good funds are owned by Angus Council, and the paper talks about how we can't legally lease common good buildings or land to the council because they're effectively owned by the same body. So the term Forfar Common Good and Montrose Common Good are somewhat misleading terms because they're Angus Common Goods. And I think as I understand, our custom and practice is that the revenue from Forfar Common Good is distributed depending on the wishes of the Forfar members, because that common good was inherited from Forfar Town Council and was meant to benefit the people of Forfar. And that seems to be our way of working. But if we're just making decisions about the assets which are owned by the common good and hence Angus Council, that surely is a matter for all members, and that's why we take it to PNR or full council. That's my understanding, and I think that using the term Arbroath Common Good or Forfar Common Good is slightly misleading term because it's an Angus Common Good, and it's the proceeds from the inherited area should go back to the people of that area, but the assets actually owned by Angus. And Councillor Hand's concerns and the Carnoustie councillors' concerns that they don't have a common good, they do have a say in what happens to these assets. Is my understanding correct from what you've said and what others have said?
Mr. Lorimer.
Thank you, Provost. Thank you, Councillor Duff. Yes, I think it is. So we account for we have separate accounts for each of the individual common good funds covering the 5 different boroughs. However, when it comes to decisions, the members of Policy and Resources or Council are the ones that make those decisions and are the ones that would be required to act in the best interests of, achieve the best value thing that I've mentioned a number of times, and to act in terms of delivery of the interests of where those common good funds relate to. So it is quite a complex set of circumstances. As I say, our custom and practice has been to take into account the wishes of the local members, but it's ultimately the Policy and Resources Committee or full council that makes the decisions, and members of those committees and full council would have to be assured that they were acting in the interests according to what the common good legislation requires.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Lorimer. Are there any other hands up, Mr. McCaskill?
There is, Provost, from Councillor Davy, but I think that might relate to a comment at this stage.
Yes, by all means.
May I make the comment, Provost?
Yeah, by all means.
Yeah, I did. It was actually good to finally, see how we envisage this working for common good funds. And obviously, the biggest one that this will impact from Forfar is obviously the Lochside Leisure Centre. So, but speaking more generally, I think it's a fair policy. I do think the transition period is fair. I think that the flexibilities are also fair. And I think this does allow us, a wee bit of common sense approach to these, which I think is welcome. And I think, members of the public would welcome. I do still have concerns over, obviously, the interaction of common goods and full council, and that it could be possible we see decisions of local ward members overridden. I'm taken into consideration, but still overridden for various reasons. And I do welcome, obviously, Mr. Lorimer's reply on, the flexibilities around it, on whether the common goods take on responsibility and demolition costs are transferred, or whether dilapidation in the building is redone. I do think, I suppose in response to Councillor Hands as well, I think the idea of sort of a one-size-fits-all, I don't think would quite work with this. And I welcome the local differences and the flexibilities. I think what might be right for the Forfar common good might not be right for Kirriemuir, or what might be right in, in Arbroath might not be right in Montrose. And I think we shouldn't try and paint the decisions we make into a one-size-fits-all approach. I think that the common sense is one of the most important things that we can have here. And I think allowing that flexibility and allowing full council to make a decision, I think is welcome. I think some of the other things within this policy also are useful. The fact that we can now have local members expressing an opinion on record, and for that to be taken into consideration. You will note that that didn't happen prior to the initial decision on Lochside, so I think that's an improvement. But I do think this report does allow some clarity. I do see what Councillor Hands did say. There is some variation and it may be different, but I think so long as full council and ward members are happy with the decision that is made and it is common sense and it is in the interests of the local, common good area, I think then we shouldn't be against saying things just because we want a one size fits all and actually this isn't right for here, this isn't right for there. I think it's really important that we allow that local differences between our towns and we get this right for each area rather than coming at this from a one size fits all approach.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Councillor Davey. Any other comments? No.
Yes.
Can we look at the recommendations then and approve items 1 and 2 and notes 3, 4 and 5? Is that approved?
Sorry, Provost. Councillor Moore did have his hand up.
Who's that?
Councillor Moore.
Oh, right, sorry.
Just a brief comment, Provost. I echo a lot of what Councillor Davey has said. I still have a bit of concern about the transitions. I also have a bit of concern about the transition period, as we'll see in the very next report. But I think as long as we are remaining flexible, I think that we can make this policy work.
Thank you very much, Councillor Moore. Councillor McMillan Douglas?
No, Provost.
Okay, your name just flashed up. Right, McCaskill, are there any other hands up?
No, there are not, Provost.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'd just like to, move that the recommendations 1 and 2 are approved and 3, 4 and 5 are noted. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Right, we can move on now to item number 8, which I suppose is a wee bit in tandem with what we'll be talking about, is the Forfar Leisure Centre. And you will note the recommendations there, in there that 1 and 2, that the detail of the Common Good Fund report, which as I spoke about, the detail of the proposal has just recently been submitted, and that's why we're not really moving forward on this until the next full council meeting. Are there any?
Provost, there's some people declared an interest and have to leave.
Yep.
Yes, Provost. Sorry, I was just about to.
I beg your pardon. Thank you for that. Yeah, the people who declared an interest, please leave. Thank you.
That is, for the record, Councillors Brown and McMillan Douglas.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Can we move forward? Hey, Donald, are they gone?
Yeah.
Just check with our business support hosts to ensure that both these members have left the meeting.
Okay. So both members have left. Right.
Yeah, both members have left the meeting, yes.
Thank you very much. As I said, the recommendations you can see in front of you there. Have we got any questions or any comments? As I intimated previously, the reason why this has just been brought forward as an update is the proposal from the club that's wanting to take this on was received quite late in the day before the bank holiday and before the election, and officers have never had a chance to really look and deal with this. But are there any comments or any questions?
Comment, Provost?
Yeah.
Right, thanks, Provost. Just given the fact that what we've just heard in the previous report, I do believe the recommendations 3 and 4 are completely sensible, and I would hope that all members agree that we just agree the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fairwell. Is the report agreed?
No.
Well,
Provost, there's Councillor Davy and Councillor Moore indicating they wish to speak.
Okay, Ron and Councillor Davy.
Thank you, Provost. Whilst obviously not taking into consideration the substance of the application because we've not seen it, can I just actually really welcome the fact that there are community groups coming forward, and I think this does show that there was and has been community appetite for trying to retain this building. We, initially had quite a headlong rush into demolition, which ended up in the courts. The initial proposal to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds to knock it down and not look at whether there was a community interest in keeping it, I think has shown that this is a mistake. And perhaps it won't lead to anything, but I think it was wrong that we didn't explore these options. I mean, previously throughout this process, we had the external reports into Lochside, that showed errors of the councillors weren't presented with a full range of options, that we weren't really able to make a full informed decision. There wasn't records kept of key decisions, and in my mind, it was a pretty damning view of the entire decision-making process. And when I asked about that, I said, could someone looking at these mistakes consider it significant? And they said yes, and that's what my view is. My view is they were significant mistakes. So the deferment I welcome because it allows us to get this right. It allows a full set of options to be presented to councillors, and I'm hopeful that this allows us to move on from where we were. I sometimes wonder if all of the time we'd spent fighting this decision in the courts and fighting this decision elsewhere, if that was spent on trying to work out if we could find a use for this building, I think we'd be in a much better position than we are just now. So I think, part of that is community groups have been spending their time trying to fight this decision rather than trying to support it. I'm glad that this shows that there isn't an obsession with it anymore, and I'm glad with the other report that we've got the flexibility. So should everything work out or should things not work out, at least we can say that we have investigated every option fully. So, let's get moving on the right track. Maybe applications won't be successful, but I think it would be a dereliction of duty, of all of our duties, to find best value if we didn't explore all of these options and we weren't presented with a full set of facts. So from the initial decision, which was an emergency item, which councillors couldn't properly scrutinise, in my opinion, to now we are taking a sensible, measured decision to defer it, to get the information to us as councillors. So I'm really glad that this is how we're now making these decisions about the future of Lochside. And I think that is a vast improvement. So regardless of what this, the end up assumptions or calculations are, I think this deferment is sensible and I think it is wise. So I would agree with the deferment.
Thank you very much, David. Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Provost. Yes, it's a very interesting situation, and the only thing that I have a concern about is recommendation 3, where we're talking about deferring the decision to the 24th of June when we've been told that the clock for this starts today. Now, if the members don't have full information until the 24th of June, they can't start considering it. So I would ask that that flexibility is used here and that the clock starts when the councillors have the information.
Councillor Hans, just one moment, please. Mr. Lorimer or Mrs. Buchanan, would you maybe give a bit of advice there? Mrs. Buchanan?
I think my understanding, Provost, is that the council has agreed a position in terms of the previous report, and that is what would apply here. So the transition period is now underway in terms of the Lochside position, but it's probably more of a legal matter than a financial one. So I would defer to my colleague if that's not right.
Mrs. Buchanan, your advice, please.
I would intend to agree with Mr. Lorimer in terms of the outcome of the previous report, unless there was some sort of material change in circumstance.
Okay.
And that would need to be now.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Buchanan. There's your answer, Councillor Moore. You know, we've got people are working in the background now. So, I mean, I think the clock is, as you say, ticking, but it's actually being worked on. And I think I think what the question is, I don't think there's a sort of should be great concern because it's actually in train at the moment. Okay.
Yes. For councillors will only have 11 months to consider it, not 12.
I think they're actually, I think to be fair, I think they're actually on it now, you know, as they pick up the information. But so be it. That's what we've got, and that's what I think we're dealing with.
Right.
Any other comments?
Yes, Provost, from Councillors Duff and Hans.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Provost. I just wanted to correct an inaccuracy in Councillor Davies' comments. Perhaps he was still in election mode. Of course, he lost the election.
Let's keep it to the point.
Well, it is to the point. He made the point that the council dragged this through the courts. That's incorrect. The council took a democratic decision at a meeting, and Mr. Donald Stewart and Mr. Guild took the council to court. The council then won the initial hearing in the Outer House, and then Mr. Guild appealed the decision. So the move to going to court was Mr. Guild and Mr. Stewart's, not the council. We took a democratic decision, and two individuals chose to challenge that decision. So that was an inaccurate statement. I just wanted to correct that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Duff. Thank you very much. And our other speaker, please, Councillor Hans.
Thank you, Provost. I have to say it's only taken about 20 minutes for my concerns that I raised around the policy and around the flexibility element of that policy to come to fruition. And I kind of rest my case almost. And I'm glad that Mrs. Buchanan has clarified the issue. This is now a decision that was taken in the previous report for the 12 months to be running. As Mr. Lorimer said earlier as well, the decision actually could have been started, the clock could have started from last September. There's already been significant leeway being given to Lochside. And, you know, if people are going to come forward with a reasonable solution, I wish them well. But you cannot keep pushing this down the road and keep pushing the boundaries, because it is really, really inherently unfair to the areas of Angus that do not have common good funds. Let's start being reasonable about this, and let's start balancing the views of a lot of people in Angus and not just a few people. I'm really quite shocked that that attitude has come up within 20 minutes.
Councillor Hans, your point is well made, and thank you very much. Any other comments?
Comments indicating, Provost.
Nothing indicated. Right, can we go back to the recommendation then and approve them as they are laid out?
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay. We can move on now to item number 9, the parking review update. You see the recommendations before you. We're going to let Councillor Salmon lead on this as He was the chairman of the member officer working group regarding parking.
Provost, can I just ask?
Hello?
We have Councillor Macmillan Douglas and Councillor Brown who left the meeting.
Bring them back in. I beg your pardon.
Just to confirm that they're able to get back into the meeting before we proceed to this item.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hello, just to make you aware that they're not in the lobby, I have emailed them to let them know that they can come back in. Thank you.
And Councillor McLaren is wanting to vacate on this one because he declared an interest on it. So we'll just have to mark time a wee bit.
Could I just confirm that Councillor McLaren has left the meeting?
Councillor McLaren is no longer in the meeting.
Okay. Have we got Councillor McMillan, Douglas and Brown back yet?
No, they still haven't entered the waiting room at all.
Yeah, well.
Just carry on, Provost.
Okay. And we're waiting on 2 members, aren't we? We're waiting on 2 members. Yeah.
Idiot.
Will somebody try to get in touch with Councillor Brown? I'll try to get in touch with you. I'll just put my hand over.
As I understand, business support have tried to contact both of them by email.
Angus, can you get back onto the meeting, please?
Back in. Oh, hold on. Nobody's let me in. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Somebody get in touch with Councillor Brown. Do the same.
That's Councillor McMillan Douglas back in the meeting room.
Yep, sorry, I mean.
Okay. Please say your name after the tone, then press the hash key and wait to be connected.
Ronnie Proctor. Mr. McCaskill, I've tried to get hold of Councillor Brown by phone, but he's not picking up. Is there any way we can contact him?
There is, well, Provost, the meeting is quorate, and if you wish to proceed, he has been contacted, so I'm not really sure if we can do anything more at this stage. He's not picking up, and he's not replying to his email.
So we should just proceed then, yeah?
That would be my advice, Provost. But
thanks very much. Okay, colleagues, item number 9. The recommendation, as I said, you could see in front of you. And I was going to ask.
Colin Brown's coming back into the meeting just now.
Pardon?
Colin Brown's coming back to the meeting just now.
Good lad. if Councillor Salmon can lead on this.
Yes, thank you, Provost. I just want to give a brief overview really on the work of the MOG, but before I speak about on-street parking, I would just wanted to reinforce again the ruling administration's position that off-street parking will remain free until the summer of 22 to support the County of Angus's COVID-19 economic recovery. Funding will be allocated in the spring 2022 council budget to enable this to be achieved. And I want to give a brief overview of the parking MOG's thoughts regards on on-street parking before full council determines whether to move away from the current 30 minutes to 45 or 60 minutes. Yesterday's article in the Dundee Courier was extremely helpful and clear in explaining the results of the public consultation, showing that 51% of first preferences were for 60 minutes. When all preferences are ranked, there is a minuscule difference between 45 and 60 minutes in the view of the 3,097 responses received. This is shown in section 4.5 of the report and the answer to question 7 in section 4.6 of the report. As the report indicates in section 4.8, the majority view of the MOG was that that on-street parking should increase from 30 minutes to 45 or 60, but the MOG did not reach a consensus on the new time duration. The MOG were in agreement that this decision should lie with all members at a full council meeting, which is today. The other issue the MOG discussed and agreed, as in section 4.9 of the report, was that for public clarity and operational enforcement reasons, that a single on-street time duration would be preferred across all council boroughs. As the MOG did not reach a clear consensus on 45 or 60 minutes, as the MOG convener, I do not feel it is appropriate for me to move the motion to determine the final decision. And I look forward to listening to all colleagues' views on this issue and to motions or amendments being brought forward. I would like to finish by thanking all the MOG members, council officers, focus group members, and more importantly, the 3,097 members of the Angus public who invested their time in giving this council their views on parking in Angus. So Provost, it's back to you for a debate amongst our colleagues on their views.
Thank you very much, Councillor Salmon, for that good and pretty full brief. Can I open it up? Any questions on what Councillor Salmon said or what's in the report?
Let's have Councillor Stewart and Darno indicating that they wish to speak.
Okay, Councillor Stewart.
Mine's is a comment, Provost.
Yeah. Carry on.
Yeah, I'm sure many will have had conversations with business owners and residents over the parking in the last couple of years. Of the people I've spoken with, while everybody was in agreement that a longer period was required for parking on our on-street parking bays, albeit there was a slight difference in opinion on the length of time it should be extended to. What we need to be mindful of is that in the majority of our boroughs, we've got plenty of off-street parking in close proximity to the high streets, where it is possible to park for longer periods of time. On-street is more for those who are just nipping into the shops for a short period, be it a chemist, barbers, or butchers, whatever the case may be. You may recall that when Police Scotland withdrew the provision of traffic wardens and we had no enforcement in our boroughs, it was a free-for-all. We had inconsiderate motorists parking all day, every day in the bays and spaces in the high streets, and it really become a bit of a premium to try and get a space if you just wanted to park for a short period of time. And then moving on, when the criminalisation of the parking enforcement came into force in 2017, this allowed us to issue fixed penalties to those who outstayed their welcome. They stayed longer than the allowed time of 30 minutes, which that did help the issue of the turnaround of traffic in the parking bays. But then during the height of the pandemic there, where due to the COVID regulations, our enforcement wardens, they were unable to patrol the streets, and it seemed to return a bit. We had a bit of an increase in vehicle owners parking all day again. But going back to the length of the time, the feeling appears to be that we increase it, the allowed time to either 45 or 60 minutes. There isn't much between it at all, as it's been said in the report. As I said before, we do have car parks that allow you to park for longer periods of time, but I think we do need to increase it on the on-street times. And I'm happy to support increasing this up to 60 minutes, which might not give us a great turnaround of spaces as what we've got at present, but it will hopefully, it'll give those who are just nipping out for a few things extra time to do that. And in turn, it'll help the high street shops recover from the effects of the pandemic. I just hope that drivers are responsible and they be considerate to the extra time that's proposed and keep the on-street parking turning over.
Thank you very much. Councillor Dunno.
Thanks for that, Councillor Stewart. I do agree with some of the things that you said. I would go with the 60 minutes. My question sort of was a wee bit answered there. Are we taking in respect the fact that people are queuing outside banks, shops everywhere now? They didn't have to do that before when we were looking at parking regulations. And also people that have been waiting for hip replacements for the last 2 years, they cannot walk from a car park to the shops in the high street. They have to get dropped off outside the dentists, hairdressers, etc., because the mobility they just don't have it. And only giving them 30 minutes to get out the car and get in where they're going and getting back in, it's not enough time. So we need to have the 60 minutes for the fact that people are queuing outside butchers, especially. The queues are horrendous. So we need to take this into consideration that we didn't have to take into consideration before. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dunno. Anyone else? Mr. McCaskill?
Yes, Provost, from Councillors Cheap, MacDonald, Whiteside, Braes and Fairweather. Provost, could I just, given the number of speakers, could I just remind yourself and members about the 3-hour rule and whether you wish to proceed?
8 minutes.
Of the business?
Yeah, 8 minutes, absolutely. Okay, well, let's, will we move to the extended, the 3-hour rule now?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you very much. And we could next go into our next speaker, Councillor Cheap.
Thanks, Provost. My view here is contrary to the last two speakers. I believe we should retain it at 30 minutes. I know I was in a minority on the MOG with this, but my view hasn't changed on this. I know all the boroughs are different, and that was one of the problems we faced in the MOG when considering this. But the whole purpose of on-street parking is for effectively quick changeover to allow other people in. And to answer what Councillor Dunno has just mentioned, is to let in people who have less ability to get in and be close to the shops to do rather quick transactions and things. We've just made our off-street parking free for the foreseeable future. If people want to stay any longer, they can go to off-street parking and park and allow the free, quick transition of vehicles into the high street. That will do a bit more good for the shops than allowing people to park long term in the car parking bays, some of which, certainly in Carnoustie, are very few and far between. So people actually grow more frustrated seeing the longer cars sitting longer in the bays needlessly when they could be sitting in the off-street car parks, which are almost equally as close, certainly in my own town. On top of all of that, £20,000 to do this, really. I mean, do we really want to go and spend this now with another year to go of council? I would advocate leaving it as is All car parks are free. On-street parking is free. It's pretty damn good for all the residents of Angus. Why change that and make it harder for some people?
Thank you very much, Councillor Kate. Next speaker, Councillor Whiteside. Next speaker, please.
Thank you, Provost. Well, I have to slightly disagree with Councillor Cheap, because not all boroughs have handy off-street car parks next to the high street, and Monteith is one of them. I think an hour is reasonable for the sake of the high street, for somebody wanting to do 2 or 3 messages, not just nip into one shop. And the point that Councillor Durno made about things such as banks, where there certainly is a big increase in queuing time. I don't think an hour is a bad thing, and I would vote for that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, please. No, who's the
Yes, Provost, it's Councillors MacDonald, then Brays, Fairweather, and a number of others after those.
Okay. Oh, you just feed them on. Okay, Councillor MacDonald.
Yeah, I must be one of the few people in this council, it would seem, that never ever seem to have any issues getting parked in any of the Angus towns before we had all these changes brought in. Yeah, you maybe had to park in a different spot and maybe walk the 5 minutes from the car park to wherever you were going. But that's where I have this fundamental disagreement maybe with Councillor Cheap here, where I would have it as an hour, as it affords, we've got plenty of parking everywhere, and it affords everybody the opportunity to park where they can, get there, get their stuff, but they're not pressured into getting out quick and going elsewhere. I'm disappointed actually in what the MOG's findings that Councillor Salmons reported about not being able to have different things in different towns, because as Councillor Davey mentioned in the last report, the different towns have different needs. And there are different restrictions that could be in place in certain towns. So if Carnoustie has a specific issue, you could have kept it at half an hour, whereas other places that maybe don't have that issue, we could bump it up to an hour. I'll be supporting the hour proposal on this one. To me, it makes the most sense, and that's how I'll be looking at it.
Thank you very much, Councillor MacDonald. Councillor Brays.
Yes, I would echo much of what Councillor MacDonald said there. I've been driving into Brechin to do stuff for 40 years now, and I have never once had to come home without doing my business because I couldn't find the parking space. Now, parking is quite, we are quite tight for parking in the centre of Brechin, but within 3 or 4 minutes walk, there's always somewhere to park your car. And if we're moving to more active travel, etc., then that's got to be borne in mind. I would also say that this is, of course, a compromise. On a wet Tuesday morning in Clark Street, Brechin, the ideal length of waiting time might be entirely different to what it would be on a sunny Friday afternoon in Montrose Street. So these are figures. There's 30 minutes, 45 or 60, and we're really being asked to pick the least worst option, the best compromise we can. I don't know what the answer is. I'm pretty sure that we need an extension from 30 minutes. Not entirely sure whether it should be 45 or 60 for the best, but I do take cognizance of the survey that we went to the bother of organising, and over 3,000 people went to the bother of replying to and giving us their views. And so I'm going to go for the 60 minutes.
Councillor Fairweather.
Yeah, thank you, Provost. And yeah, I would like to thank everybody as well that contributed to the survey, and I'd also like to thank all the members of the MOG. And obviously, there's going to be a lot of different views here. But remembering, of course, our high streets and smaller areas like Arbroath and with its Westport area have actually been slaughtered during this. and they've got a lot of on-street parking. So where do I go from this? We can bring this back in the next 6 months after the 6 months rule, and we might want to change it again. What would my preference be? I'm going to go with the 60 minutes. The 60 minutes, right, to give our businesses and to give their customers that little bit more time to get in and out their shops. I think that's the sensible way forward. And I'm not just going to say that that's what I'll be agreeing with. I will be moving that as a motion. Thank you.
Okay. Next speaker, please.
Yes, Provost, it's Councillors Moore and Duff and Hans.
Duff and Hans, okay. Councillor Duff. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Provost. A few points. I was a member of the MOG. I think it was very well run, very well organised by Mr. Scott, and the survey was superb, getting so many 3,500 respondents. It rather puts into pale the one on the leisure centre, doesn't it? The first point I would make, I actually agree with, I think it was Councillor Cheap, the point that we could have had different time limits in different towns. That was discounted by the MOG, I think, because it was felt that officers would not manage to do it. I would observe that other councils manage it. You go to Perth or Edinburgh or wherever else, you can have different times in different parts of town. But we just said that was technically too difficult, so we discounted that. I've had a lot of representation from people who live near town centres who have got 30-minute waiting in the street they live in, and they would love to have permits. And I think, I again accept that is quite heavy on officer time and so on, and we're short of staff. But that's something I think we should look at in the future. It might be an income stream. I would go for 45 minutes because I think that's the compromise. I think that the concerns that Councillor Cheap's made about Carnoustie, I share about with Brechin, where there are very few on-street parking spaces. If you allow people to park too long, you'll clog up your available spaces. So I would go for the 45-minute compromise. And I think Councillor Fairweather is wrong. We can't change it in 6 months' time because that will be an additional cost. And there's always the traffic order procedure. So it would take a lot of time and it will cost us more money to change it. So we want to change it once and get it right.
Okay. Thanks very much, Councillor Duff. Councillor Hans.
Sorry, I think Councillor Moore might have been first.
Ladies first.
Gentlemen, you crack on, Councillor Hans.
Okay, but at the risk of asking a sort of a blind question or making a blind statement here, there was concern mentioned earlier about access for people with limited mobility, etc. I would imagine what we're talking about here, we're talking about specific designated parking bays, but we've also got the yellow, double and single lines. I would just like to point out, if you're a blue badge holder, you could access parking that perhaps the public can't anyway, so that increases parking spaces. But I would actually like to ask, if we are looking at the 60 minutes, and that's what I would support, because I think COVID has raised specific issues and possibly social distancing. It might not be continually with us over a year, but there might be spells in a year that it comes back. And taking on board Councillor Duff's point about the TROs, they do cost money and they take time to implement. So I think the 60 minutes would go be a useful suggestion. But I would also like to see us holding a campaign as well as we're doing that, to emphasise there's a lot of people that don't quite qualify for blue badges, and some people are fairly harshly let down by the assessment system for blue badges, but do have significant mobility issues. Also thinking of parents with young children as well. So maybe we actually need to start a campaign asking motorists to be kinder to other motorists who do need that space, And also, as Councillor Bray says, for people that can get involved in active travel, let's try and encourage that as well. So acknowledge that there's limited spaces. There's people really that need them more than others, but the people that are blue badge holders can probably be accommodated within that process as well.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hans. Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Provost. I agree with Councillor Duff. We are trying to find a compromise. Now, when you look at the preferences, if you add the first and the second preferences together, for 60 minutes, you've got 61%. For 45 minutes, you've got 97%. And I think if we're wanting to give people time to do their business, but also have a through flow of vehicles so that we can get more vehicles in and out, then 45 minutes seems to be the best compromise.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Moore. Mr McCaskill, are there any other hands showing?
Yes, there are, Provost, from Councillors Davey and Macmillan Douglas.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Davey.
Thank you, Provost. Yeah, I think it was an interesting report, and obviously with the consultation replies, but I'd just like to perhaps pick up something Councillor Duff said early on about residential permits. I mean, it's a strange turn of affairs because in 2017, Councillor Duff was saying that residential permits should be a non-starter when we first looked at this as the council. Perhaps he also was distracted by his loss on the regional list as well when he led the SNP to the worst result in 2007. Sorry, I get distracted. It was just in response to the earlier point. No, I agree with an hour. I think an hour is, and I understand the differences, and I'm not against the idea of time differences in the waiting time. For example, should, as Councillor Cheap has mentioned, 30 minutes seem more applicable in Carnoustie, I don't see why, should there be huge local demand for this later on, that couldn't be revisited for specifically Carnoustie if that was deemed to be an improvement. But I think 1 hour, I think for Forfar, and I think for other towns, I think 1 hour is a reasonable amount. I think that allows people, especially as has been mentioned with mobility issues, to gain access, and it just allows that bit more security. And I think it also just shows the difference as well between Angus and Dundee, and hopefully can attract some of the trade from Dundee to come into Angus without, Dundee's reintroducing car parking charges either very shortly or they already have. And the difference obviously is in Angus is now it's free in the off street, and hopefully if it's 45 or an hour, it's actually increased as well. So perhaps that might encourage more people to stay in Angus and spend their money, or even some folk from Dundee come out to spend their money in Angus. So I would support the hour.
Thank you very much, Councillor Davey. Councillor Macmillan Douglas.
Thank you, Provost, very much. It strikes me that probably none of us have covered ourselves in glory on this issue over the last 4 years. We've all swapped positions as we've striven to get something which raises some cash for a cash-strapped council, while at the same time not damaging shops. In fact, I think we've managed the finances in a different way, and that's really taken an awful lot of the pressure off this. And the real priority now must be to do everything we can in the retail sector across Angus. I would like to do two things. Firstly, to applaud Councillor Salmond, who I think has done a simply fantastic job in a very difficult situation in bringing light and reason to all this. And I must say, I'm full of praise for what he has done. I'm sure people of Angus will be as well. I would go for 60 minutes, not because I think I really know the difference between 45 and 60 minutes and the effect on our shops, but purely because of the point that I think Councillor Duff somebody made, that we don't want to be changing back, in 6 months' time. And therefore, I would go for 60 minutes, and let's do everything we can to get our businesses going. Thank you, Provost.
Douglas. Have we got any other hands?
Yes, we do. Provost, from Councillors Fotheringham, Boyd, sorry, yes.
Fotheringham, Boyd.
That's it. Councillor Macmillan Douglas still showing his hand up, but yeah, just two more speakers, I think, Provost.
All right, Councillor Fotheringham.
Thank you, Provost. I'll keep it short because I'm agreeing with most of the comments from most of the members, but my ward colleagues, Councillor Whiteside and Hans, have already touched on this, and I've mentioned it, as you know, our group many a time, that Moneyfeith and Sidlaw do not have any town centre Angus Council owned and run car parks. So I will be supporting a move to 60 minutes, Provost. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Boyd.
Yes, thank you, Provost. It's been a very interesting debate. I picked up the bits about 45 minutes elsewhere and different. I think months ago I mentioned Broughty Ferry as an example of 45 minutes. Yet Dundee was only half an hour. So you can have it in different places and different things. So that's my first comment. I watched with interest, or listened with interest about Councillor Fairweather and the bits about the high streets, you know, and giving them an hour. But you'll get more customers if you give them 30 minutes than you do if someone's there for an hour. People go in and out. They'll get their trinkets from one place and then let someone else. You'll definitely get more footfall if you have it at 2. You'll get more people coming if there's 30 minutes than 1 hour. Hence the reason why I believe that Councillor Cheap situation was one that was the 30 minutes, and we're also I'm trying to put it in apples and pears here. We're talking about changing the on street, but that was for the time when we thought that there were still going to be the car parking charges. Now, if we put car parking charges out of the charges out of the equation until the next administration, why don't we just do it with this? There's been talk of delay anyway. Let's Councillor Duff is quite right. We can't come back in 6 months' time. That would be the 6-month rule. Why don't we make it the 343-day rule? Because that's when the next election is, and then leave this problem along with the situation of charges to the next administration. That keeps everything. That's what everyone, you know. If we've done it with one thing, why aren't we doing it with the other? So I would like to back Councillor Cheap, and would save 20,000 that would be that we could well do with just now. So the 20,000 and delay it until the next election, similar as we've done to charges.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Boyd. Are there any other hands up?
Yes, there's Provost from Councillor Salmond and Hans.
Okay, Councillor Salmond. Second go, Councillor Hans. Right. Councillor Salmond, on you go. Councillor Salmond.
Thank you, Provost. I've listened to the debate, and I think the consensus amongst members is actually 60 minutes. So I'd like to second Councillor Fairweather's motion now for the 60 minutes. I'm really conscious that we've done a significant consultation with the people of Angus, and it's probably one of the best we've actually done. And I'd like to thank Mr. Scott and his team for organising this. We've had over 3,000 responses, and there is a clear message from the residents who took part in this that they want us to move away from the 30 minutes in our town centres. I feel it would be rather insulting if we didn't take that into consideration as part of the decision we're making today. I'm conscious that later this year we're about to go out to do quite a large consultation as a council to plan for the future of this council. So I think it would be sending the wrong signal out to our residents at the moment if we didn't take into consideration the results of this consultation. So I'm happy to, as I say, second Councillor Fairweather. The slight difference I do have with Councillor Fairweather on his comments, I have to apologise for this, leader, is that this is not for 6 months. This is definitely for the long term. You know, we need to make a statement here that this is going to be for many, many years. We are investing £20,000. I think that's a good investment, and I think the people of Angus will think it's a good investment when they see the difference of the time that they can actually park in our high streets across Angus. Thank you.
Councillor Hines.
Yeah, Provost, mine is a point of clarification. I promise you I'm not wanting to speak twice necessarily. It was just the issue about delaying a decision until next year and making the next council take the decision. Surely, well, I wonder about the financial competency of that, because that's assuming a budget would already be available to support the consequential impact on off-street parking. We're not in a position to do that, so we really actually need to look at this in terms of how we deal with on-street parking today, without looking at setting additional financial issues that are uncertain on the next council.
I think, Councillor Hans, to be fair, that's actually been looked at by the finance convener, the current finance convener. That's actually, or sorry, the incumbent finance convener, and that's actually been factored in. We'll take your point, but it actually has been factored in. Okay, is that it, Mr. McCaskill?
No, Councillor Speed has just raised her hand.
Councillor Speed, yeah, okay. Councillor Speed.
Always late, but worth the wait, Provost. Yeah, I've sat and listened, and I think this is a really kind of complex scenario and situation with like lots of different competing factors. I think, you know, we do need to take on board the point in terms of when the consultation went out, it was looking at all of our parking as a whole, including the off street, and that is obviously now free. Certainly the feedback I've had from residents is that they would like an increase, which is demonstrated in the consultation feedback. But I think many people feedback the need for us to be able to have that kind of flow of traffic and in and out, with people not kind of driving along and finding that they can't get a space and having too long to wait. So I think that's important, as is the points that have been raised in terms of accessibility, and that not everybody has a blue badge or can get a blue badge if it's a shorter term mobility issue that they're experiencing. So I'm very mindful of that, but I do think we need to strike a balance, and that we do need to ensure that there is a good flow of traffic in and out, and that indeed those that do drive along that need close access are able to get it without lengthy waits. So yeah, I'm more mindful to go with the 45 with a view of then looking at this further down the line as a whole, once we've kind of gone through our recovery phase, hopefully encouraging more and more people into our town centres, but also being mindful of our hopes and ambitions in terms of active travel as well. And we encourage that, you know, the car doesn't have to be the first means of travel for those that are able to get around differently. But I do like Councillor Hans's points in terms of a campaign to raise awareness of being kind as motorists and leaving place and space for others, and also recognising the fact that it can be quite difficult for people to get a blue badge as well. So yeah, I think this is not an easy one, but I'd be more mindful to take a kind of gradual approach and then relook at our whole kind of parking, active travel, and footfall in our town centres at a later date, and then reassessing and implementing then.
Councillor Speed, I would second that. I would second your 45 minutes if you're needing a seconder.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks very much, Councillor Boyd. Thank you, Councillor Speed. Are there any other speakers?
Yes, there is, Provost. I think Councillor Brown has been raising his actual hand for some time.
Okay. Right, Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I would agree with Councillor Speed. I think 45 minutes. If you take the hour, that's 7 cars a day. It's going to be able to stop outside that shop. Now, well, I just think if you need an hour, especially in Forfar, there are car parks, 1, 2, 3, 4 car parks you could go to, and I certainly would be for an increase, but it would be for 45 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Brown. Anyone else?
These are all the speakers, Provost. I wonder just at this juncture, you would want me maybe to come in and clarify where we are in terms of any
Well, what I was just going to do, Mr. McCaskill, was to ask the members if they would note one and consider 2, and then on 3 in the recommendations that we have. Well, we've got 2 motions there. One is from Councillor Fairweather, seconded by Councillor Salmon, that the on-street parking be increased to 1 hour. And then we have got a second motion that I could see moved by Councillor Speed and seconded by Councillor Boyd, that the on-street parking be extended to 45 minutes. Are you happy with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. On 1 and 2, are we happy to note number 1 and consider the number 2? Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Okay. And then number 3, if I could get Councillor Fairweather to move that he wants to have the on-street parking increased to 60 minutes. Councillor Fairweather.
Yeah, right. Thank you, Provost. Given that not all will require that 60 minutes, I will move that this council move to 60-minute on-street car parking in Angus.
Okay. And your seconder?
I'll second that, Provost. Thank you.
Thank you. Amendments. We've got an amendment from Councillor Speed. Councillor Speed, would you like to give your amendment?
Yeah, thank you, Provost. I wasn't quite prepared. It's become, my statement's become an amendment, seconded by Councillor Boyd. Yeah, I think I would like to make the amendment to 45 minutes with a view that we then review the situation once we are kind of further through our COVID recovery phase, where we can take into consideration the movement and footfall within our town centres, and also look at any impact that an increase in on-street parking has had, either positive or negative, and taking into consideration perhaps the impact on residents who live within streets where there's on-street parking. So yeah, that would be my amendment.
45 minutes. Councillor Boyd, are you happy to second that?
I'm happy to second it with the views of the situation. Let's do the Broughty Ferry. It works perfectly well in Broughty Ferry. They will have the most vibrant high streets. I'm taking slightly, I look at the business side of things, Councillor Speed. I think it's a win-win for each of us, that with all the things that Councillor Speed has said, but I'm looking at the business side of things as well. And 45 minutes, just like Broughty Ferry, would be an idea, and get the more of the turnover, similar to the stuff that Councillor Brown had mentioned as well. You'd only have 7 people. You'll have more if you do it for 45.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement there, Councillor Boyd. I'm looking at it from a business point of view as well, and ensuring that there is that kind of
that's fine.
So thank you.
Mr. McCaskill, could we go to the vote?
Yes, Provost, we can. The motion by Councillor Fairweather, seconded by Councillor Salmon, is to change the on-street parking duration to 60 minutes. The amendment.
Provost, can I just bring in a point of information, please? Members have been talking about having to wait 6 months before we can look at this again. Under Standing Order 26.2, where the Provost rules that a material change of circumstances has occurred to such extent that it is appropriate for the issue to be reconsidered, a decision may be altered or revoked within 6 months by a subsequent decision. So if things change, we can always come back to it within 6 months, as long as the Provost rules that there has been a material change.
Got to actually have the material. Thanks very much for that, Councillor. We've got to have the material change. That's got to be shown. Can we go back to Mr. McCaskill and let's get on with the vote, please?
Thank you, Provost. I'll continue with the motion on amendment. The motion by Councillor Fairweather, seconded by Councillor Salmon, is to change the on-street car parking duration to 60 minutes. The amendment by Councillor Speed, seconded by Councillor Boyd, is to change the on-street parking duration to 45 minutes with a view to reviewing the situation post-COVID and also assessing the impact on residents. Please vote motion or amendment. Provost?
Motion.
Deputy Provost?
Motion.
Councillor Bell?
Motion.
Councillor Boyd?
Amendment.
Councillor Braze?
Motion.
Councillor Brown?
Amendment.
Councillor Cheap?
No vote.
Councillor Davey?
Motion.
Councillor Devine?
Amendment.
Councillor Duff?
Amendment.
Councillor Darno?
Motion.
Councillor Fairweather?
Motion.
Councillor Hans?
Motion.
Councillor King?
Motion. No, wait a minute. Yeah, motion.
Sorry, did I clarify? Is that Councillor Laurie saying motion?
No, amendment for Councillor Laurie.
Thank you. Councillor Macmillan Douglas?
Motion.
Councillor MacDonald?
Motion.
Councillor Moore? Councillor Moore?
Councillor Moore.
Sorry, amendment.
Councillor Miles?
Motion.
Councillor Nicholl?
Motion.
Councillor Salmond?
Motion.
Councillor Speed?
Amendment.
Councillor Stewart?
Motion.
Councillor Sturrock?
Amendment.
Councillor Wan?
Motion.
And Councillor Whiteside.
Motion.
The motion is carried by 17 votes to 8, Provost.
Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues. We'll now move on to the final item, agenda item number 10, the Director of Communities interim arrangements. You could see the recommendation before you. It's only a noting report. However, before we debate it, I'd just like to ask the Chief Executive to discuss the appointment of the interim Director of Communities.
Thank you, Provost. It's Mark Armstrong here, the Deputy Chief Executive. The Chief Executive's had to leave for another meeting, so she gives her apologies. As the report advises, it's informing Council of the arrangements that have been put in place to fill the post on an interim basis following the retirement of Stuart Ball, the Director for Communities. And I know that Councillor Salmond wishes to make some comments just to thank Stuart for his work, and I would wish to echo that. The report does detail that through the arrangements that were put in place, a recruitment process took place internally over the previous weeks, and interviews were held yesterday, and I'm pleased to advise the Council that an appointment was made, and we appointed Alison Smith, the Service Leader of Strategic Policy and Economy, to be the Interim Director for Communities during this period whilst we wait till we've made a permanent appointment. In the meantime, we're having conversations with directors and service leaders about our current structural arrangements and just identifying if we believe we should be making any changes to those, really to take account of our response to the pandemic and some of the key priorities that the Council has moving forward. And as the report advises, we're intending to bring a report to Council at the end of June with the outcome of that review process, and that would then enable Council to consider any changes that are proposed, and we could then move to an external and national recruitment process for a permanent director to fill the current vacant post. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you very much, Mr. Armstrong. The other Mark, Councillor Salmond, would you like to just go on from there?
Yes, thank you, Provost. Firstly, I would just like to congratulate Alison Smith on her well-deserved appointment as Interim Director of Communities, and I look forward to working with Alison in my role as Convener of Communities. I've known and worked with Alison for most of my time as a councillor, and I know she'll be a fantastic addition to the Communities team. I'd also like to acknowledge Stuart Ball, the recently retired Director of Communities. Stuart had a massive breadth of experience and knowledge and was very supportive to me as convener. I'd like to wish Stuart a happy retirement, a healthy and a long retirement, and I'm sure we'll see him in the very near future once normality returns. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you very much, Councillor Salmon. Before I open it up for comments, I'd just like to reiterate what's been said. Stuart Ball's actually, my time in the council has been absolutely outstanding. He's been a great director of communities. He's listened to councillors, he's listened to his officers, some difficult decisions he's had to make, and by gosh, he's not been fair to do them. A really, really outstanding man, and I wish him well. So I open that up for any comments.
Provost.
Yeah, Councillor Fairweather.
Yes, right. Thank you. You know, when I got the phone call from Stuart Ball to say that he was retiring, Ball knew that he had particular problems with his eyes. But I spoke with Stuart for a good part of 30, maybe probably more minutes, and how much I will miss that man. Our conversations, and he was my go-to man, for problems, and I'm sure he was with a lot of other elected members. Like Councillor Salmond, I wish him well, and I hope he does have an extremely long and happy retirement. And we have promised that we will keep in touch and we will meet up. Even though he's a Dundee supporter and I'm a Rangers supporter. But can I also add that I've worked with Alison Smith when she's had various roles with this council for the last 14 years, and she is an extremely able officer, and I look forward, and I'm sure the rest of you will agree with me, to working with her in her new role, for however long she's in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Devine, do you want to say something?
I wasn't going to really, because I've already said everything to Stuart himself, but like Councillor Fairweather, he was always somebody that you could go to and he would listen and he would take on board what you were saying and come back, which is always a great thing when they come back with feedback to you. So I absolutely appreciate his difficult decision, but it had to be taken, and I wish him well too. And I'm sure Alison will be an excellent interim director.
Thanks very much, Councillor Devine. Mr. McCaskill, can I see any hands?
Yes, we have Councillor Stewart, Brays and Fotheringham.
Okay, Councillor Stewart.
Thanks, Provost. Yeah, I'd like to congratulate Alison Smith on being successful in the interim role, and I do look forward to working with her. Previous things that we've had to do together already, it's been great. I've also got to say a massive thanks to Stuart Ball. Just what everyone else has already said, he was absolutely fantastic colleague to work with, and he is going to be a great loss to Angus Council. It was a sad day for me and the convener when he told us that he was going to be retiring. It was actually quite emotional, if I'm honest. He's got a vast knowledge, his remit, in particular the waste and recycling side of things. I kept telling him that he was talking a lot of rubbish, but that went right over his head as well. Knowledge didn't stop there either. He introduced me to the best places to find decent steak pies in Dundee. And I'm sure if he's at home watching just now, he'll be having a wee laugh to himself about that. But I can't speak highly enough of him and his dedication towards the role that he done within the council. And I'm sure everybody here, along with his colleagues in the various departments that he oversaw, they would agree with me on that. So just enjoy retirement, Stuart.
Thanks very much, Councillor Stewart. Councillor Brace. Councillor Brace.
Yes, well, I'd just like to reiterate what others have said regarding Stuart Bog. As one of the SNP spokespeople on the Communities Committee, I had regular contact and meetings with Stuart. I always found him to be right on top of the game, very diligent and very, very able. And also really quite good fun to get on with. And yes, he is a great loss to the council, and but every confidence in Alison Smith. So all the best to Stuart.
Thank you very much, Councillor Brace. Councillor Fotheringham.
Thank you, Provost. I believe that Stuart may actually be watching this on the live feed. So just, Stuart, if you are, you're a great colleague to work with, an excellent director, a very, very level-headed person. I never saw Stuart flustered. He was always professional in any advice and anything that he carried out. And I can always remember one thing that will stick in my mind about Stuart. He just went way above the call of duty. He phoned me one day, a couple of days before we were due to have the Long Service Awards at Brecon High School. And he says, look, I'm in Forfar. He says, you don't need to drive, I'll pick you up. And he did. He came right to the house and picked me up and dropped me off again. So that's the type of gentleman he was. And I wish him a very long, healthy and a happy retirement, because I know his wife also worked for the council and I had dealings with Wendy as well. And she's also now retired. Alison Smith, I have had the pleasure of working with for the last 10 years. And the first time I met Alison, she was in external funding and then went to economic development, a very, very capable officer. And I wish her well in her post as the interim director of communities. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you very much, Deputy Provost. Mr. McCaskill, any other names on the frame?
No more speakers, Provost.
Sorry?
No more speakers, Provost. No more, no.
No more. Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, as I said, the report for noting, are we agree the recommendations 1 and 2? Is this report agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for your perseverance. That's been not too bad. It's not been a 7-hour meeting, but thank you very much for your support and your input. Thank you.
Provost.